The PFAS landscape is always changing in new and unexpected ways, so it's important to stay up to date. Any trace of PFAS could trigger a reporting obligation.
Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Welcome back to the Environmental Evolutions Podcast. I'm your host, Linn Bumpers. Today, I'm going to be talking once again about PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, and EPA's proposed rule to amend reporting requirements under the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, for these chemicals. If you've listened to our previous PFAS episodes, you'll remember that PFAS is an umbrella term for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS have extremely strong carbon-fluorine bonds, allowing them to imbue moisture, grease, heat, and stain resistance in consumer and industrial products. Of these products, from food and cosmetic packaging, to firefighting foam, to clothing, medical devices, and more. Unfortunately, the same properties that give PFAS these useful characteristics also make them highly persistent and long-lasting in the environment. PFAS use began in the 1960s, and there were historically very limited reporting requirements tied to PFAS. Accordingly, the EPA and the public had very limited data on just how widespread these chemicals were, or what risks they might pose. By the mid-2000s, EPA began to recognize the growing concerns around PFAS and launched its 2006 PFAS Stewardship Program, a voluntary effort where major chemical companies agreed to cut down on certain long-chain PFAS like PFOA and PFOS in both emissions and products. The key word here is voluntary. There were no penalties for missing the reduction targets and no penalties for limited reporting. Still, many of the largest manufacturers signed on and made real progress. The catch, though, was that the program didn't cover short-chain PFAS, which were often used as replacements. Those newer versions were marketed as safer, but they later turned out to be persistent and mobile in the environment as well. PFAS weren't explicitly listed under TSCA either, so the reporting there was a hit or miss. This started to shift with growing public pressure and new laws. That brings us to the rule we are talking about today. In 2019, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. I'm going to call it the 2020 NDAA. The 2020 NDAA officially added PFAS compounds to the list of chemicals covered by the Toxic Release Inventory, and more importantly, amended TSCA Section 8A7 to require EPA to promulgate a rule collecting information from, quote, each person who has manufactured PFAS since January 1st, 2011. The intent behind this rule was so EPA could collect information from manufacturers of PFAS to better understand the levels of PFAS in the United States. In 2024, EPA published a final rule to fulfill this obligation. In the 2024 PFAS reporting rule, EPA required reporting by any entity that had manufactured or imported any PFAS or any articles containing PFAS in any amount at any time since January 1st, 2011. It is sufficient to say that this rule cast a wide net, pulling in players from all kinds of industries that had never before had reporting obligations under TSCA. So not just the manufacturers. With no minimum concentration thresholds, any trace of PFAS could trigger a reporting obligation. However, in order to narrow this rule, EPA does only require disclosure of information known or reasonably ascertainable by the reporting entity. So this looks like companies taking reasonable efforts to conduct supply chain surveys, internal record audits, company-wide surveys, or other reasonable inquiry methods to verify whether any PFAS substances had been imported. While this made the no minimum concentration threshold a little more manageable, you can imagine it created significant costs to those companies doing due diligence. This brings us to today, where on November 13th, 2025, EPA issued a proposed rule to amend the 2024 PFAS reporting rule. According to EPA, this new proposal is intended to make the reporting requirements, quote, more practical and implementable and reduce unnecessary or potentially duplicative reporting. The rule is aimed towards Administrator Zeldin's Powering the Great American Comeback initiative by reducing regulatory burdens and burdens on industry by ensuring that EPA receives PFAS data most relevant to the agency. The key parts of this rule include 4 exemptions that EPA is proposing, which would exempt certain industry and reporters from being obligated under the rule. First, EPA created a de minimis exemption. This means that PFAS manufactured or imported in mixtures or products at concentrations of 0.1% or lower are excluded from the reporting requirements. This exemption would apply regardless of how much of the product is made, and EPA states that this responds to small businesses who commented during the original 2024 rule about the large regulatory burdens in determining PFAS in past imports with such low concentrations. One of the things EPA seeks public comment on specifically here is the proposed 0.1 de minimis concentration and whether some other level might be more appropriate. The second, and in my opinion, most important exemption that EPA is proposing in this rule is an exemption for all imported articles containing PFAS. TSCA typically regulates the manufacture of chemicals, and the definition of manufacture includes the import of articles. Under TSCA, article means, quote, a manufactured item formed to a specific shape or design for a specific end use and has limited change in chemical composition during its end use. In other words, this means products that are already made, like clothing, cookware, electronics, gaskets, all of the different articles that might be imported that could happen to contain PFAS are exempt from reporting requirements when they're imported. In proposing this exemption, EPA concludes that the National Defense Authorization Act is best read as excluding articles and targeting PFAS manufacturers themselves. EPA's explanation of this is that the manufacturers of the chemicals themselves that have PFAS are the ones that best know the concentrations of PFAS and are in the best position to do the reporting. The third exemption would be one for PFAS manufactured as byproducts, impurities, non-isolated intermediates, or upon incidental exposure. This exemption goes towards EPA's attempts to apply reporting obligations only to those likely to have the relevant information. Finally, there's an exemption for PFAS used for research and development. EPA is seeking comments on this exemption as to whether there should be some small quantities exemption for PFAS in research and development activities rather than a blanket exemption. Aside from those 4 exemptions, EPA is looking for public comment on some other key aspects of the proposed rule prior to the publication of the final rule. EPA wants to know how it might combine some of these proposed exemptions while still offering the same level of regulatory relief. For example, in combining the articles import exemption and the 0.1% de minimis exemption, they would be able to ensure that articles primarily composed of non-PFAS elements would also not require reporting. EPA is also looking for comments as to whether the agency should modify any of the calculations in its economic analysis. And on the more technical side, EPA is asking for comments related to amending the scope of reportable chemicals. That ties into the structural definition of PFAS that EPA has finalized in the proposed rule, as opposed to a list of specific discrete PFAS. There's a 45-day public comment period, which will end on December 29, 2025. According to the Spring 2025 Unified Agenda, EPA expects to publish a final rule in June 2026. The reporting rule under the proposed changes The reporting period under the proposed changes would then open 2 months after the final rule and would stay open for 3 months after that. I expect EPA to be getting a lot of comments on this proposed rule, and it will be interesting to see how the final rule is or is not changed. Generally, the PFAS landscape is always changing in new and unexpected ways, so it's important to stay up to date. Thank you so much for joining me to chat about the latest updates, and thank you so much to India Woodfolk for helping me prepare for this episode. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Bots podcast. Baker Bots has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Bots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Bots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.